千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we delve deeply into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. So Tao Te Ching 38, what did we do before? We've already spent several meetings going through this rather long chapter. 29 lines, significantly longer than most of the other chapters. So initially, I presented this view in order to divide it into the top half and bottom half. And when we go to the top half, we did a detailed analysis of the sectional breaks by noting all the characters that repeat themselves. And in the case of 38, there were quite a few. Having broken it down, we could then see that 38 begins with the discussion of high virtue and low virtue in the first 4 lines, and then extending down to the next 4 lines. So a total of 8 lines from 1 to 8 talking about high virtue and low virtue. Then Lao Tzu switches gear and talks about high benevolence, high righteousness, and high etiquette. So there's a reason for all that. This is just on the top half of Tao Te Ching 38. Then we also covered the second half, the lower half, where we begin with a discussion on what happens when one level is lost and you descend to the next one. So this actually provides a recipe on how to get back to the level, the realm of the Tao as well. So we'll talk about that momentarily. So that's the top section here from 16 to 19 in the second half, talking about losing a level, descending to the next one. Then, and this is important for today, the next 3 lines from 20 to 22 is about a kind of person that is described by Lao Tzu as a very negative kind of individuals, the beginning of chaos, as you see in line 22. Who are those people? Those who have etiquette, as in those who are fake in their politeness and civility. So for instance, those who say that they just want to engage in a civil discussion with you about a controversial topic, but they're actually snakes in that they are intending to dominate the conversation through a variety of tricks, debating techniques. So don't really have goodwill, but they're hiding it beneath a veneer of etiquette. So that's the kind of people that Lao Tzu is absolutely opposed to. Then the next 3 lines, we'll talk about this more. Those with foreknowledge, specifically those with the kind of knowledge that is strictly based on book learning, theories, without any kind of in-depth real world experience. That, Lao Tzu says, is the beginning of ignorance. So one type of individual, the fake polite people, are the beginning of chaos, and those with the superficial level of knowledge untested by real life, they are the beginning of ignorance. Then we get to where we were able to arrive at by the end of the last meeting, talking about the great person. So there's some translation notation there where I spoke of the great person is actually can be legitimately translated as the great man. This is it's a male term in the original Chinese, And here I've made it the universal mankind reference of the great person because the assumption is that Lao Tzu is addressing all of us, not just half the population, not just the males, but also the females. So we're going to be picking up our discussion here on line 26. And as usual, we'll just work through maybe half a dozen recap slides to get everybody all caught up. Okay, so initially, and we covered this for a few meetings previously, we talked about summarizing the different levels. This is from the first half of the Tao Te Ching. The first half starts out with high virtue, which is very close to the level of the Tao. High virtue is where you practice virtues naturally, without being forced, without being reminded. Low virtue is before you get to that, when you need to practice, remind yourself to practice until it becomes second nature. Then in the first half, there's also high benevolence, high righteousness. So respectively, high benevolence is when you do good things for other people and your thoughts and concerns are about the welfare of other people rather than your own. You don't have a hidden agenda to benefit from your charitable actions. That's high benevolence. High righteousness, this is where you do what is right. In the level of high righteousness, which we explained with the story, the name of the story is Purchasing Yi. Yi means righteousness. It wasn't actually a purchase. It was just about doing the right thing, knowing that the karmic mechanism, things will come full circle so that one day when you need it the most, the right things will be done to you and for you. So that was a story from before. Then we get into the high etiquette. The high etiquette is the level where someone who is following all the rules, following all the forms, can then be insistent on other people following the same thing. That isn't necessarily always a negative thing. It could be because this person means well and wants you to follow the same forms of etiquette, the proper forms, and as a way to practice and lead you into the higher levels. So we went through this last time, and I also want to point out that when we got to the beginning of the second half, this changed a little bit. So if you keep your eyes on the different levels, from high virtue all the way down to high etiquette, you'll see the change. In the second half, it evolved a little bit as if Lao Tzu takes a step back to look at the overall picture. So now the same 5 levels, but now the top is the level of the Tao, followed by the level of the virtue. And remember, this is divided into high virtue and low virtue in the beginning of this chapter. And then you can assume that there's also high benevolence, low benevolence, high righteousness, low righteousness, and high etiquette, low etiquette. So as an example, when you practice low benevolence, you are doing so with the purpose of showcasing what a great person you are. Whereas high benevolence, there's no thought about benefits to the self, only benefits to other people. And the notation that I emphasized previously was that notice that this is a value judgment. So in practicing the Tao for yourself, do not shy away from making judgment calls. Figure out what it is that is beneficial for yourself in life. In the authentic Tao, there's no such thing as everything is equally perfect. There's always better and worse. It's up to you to discover that for yourself. The only thing about the Tao is that what is better for you and worse for you may not be better or worse for other people, in that everyone has a customized, personalized set of values that apply. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to recap the level that is not called out specifically, but would be the level that if we did divide this up into high virtue, low virtue, high benevolence, low benevolence, high righteousness, low righteousness, high etiquette, low etiquette, we will be looking at the lowest level, the level of low etiquette. Low etiquette is the level of the hypocrite. So again, following the recap, previously we talked about line 20, those who have etiquette. So this is what I'm referring to as the low etiquette. These are the people who appear to be following all the forms correctly. They seem to be so incredibly courteous and polite, but that politeness, that courtesy, those are just a thin shell hiding the beginning of chaos, just a facade. These are the phony people. So the hidden agenda in the low etiquette is that they want to advance their own ambitions, and they're hiding their personal agenda with the appearance of being very proper. So that's one type of individual that is at the bottom of the ranking that Lao Tzu provided. There's another type. So another 3 lines describes those with foreknowledge, which superficially, like those with etiquette, seems like a positive term, but is actually described in a very negative context. As you can see in line 25, this is still a recap from last time, described as the beginning of ignorance. So how can it be that knowledge is not, the powerful, great thing that we've been taught? Well, I've listed 4 reasons here. The 4 reasons include how knowledge can be used for things that are not necessarily so great, that it can lead to arrogance. Previously, we talked about the knowledge trap and the knowledge obstacle. And then number 4, the danger of book knowledge without real life experience. All of these previously were illustrated in the story called Ancient Books, which comes from the Tao of Success. It's from the middle of the book, one of my personal favorite stories, and it describes, I think, quite well the dangers of the knowledge trap and the knowledge obstacle. So that is, again, a recap from last time, and let's move on to the final recap slide, which gets us back to line 26, 大丈夫. As I pointed out, this is really the male gender, so great man would be valid as a translation. So we're changing it to great person to keep up with the times, but with a notation here that originally it was referring to the male gender, but my personal belief is that Lao Tzu wants everyone to follow these teachings regardless of gender. So this is also addressing all students of the Tao, again, regardless of gender. So this is setting us up for our discussion today. So as usual, we have spent about 15 minutes in a quick recap. Okay, so let's talk about line 27. Line 27 says, the great person abides in substance and does not dwell on the thin shell. Let's talk about what that means. So here in lines 27, 28, 29, which is the very last line, these 3 lines talk about what the great person would do. What would the truly great person do? Well, for one thing, he or she would place far more importance on substance. Substance here refers to hope. Abides in substance. Hope, this character, the third character here, on line 27 means thick. Here, the context is something that is substantial. So it's easy to understand this character when you think about the fact that you can describe someone who is stocky as a thick person, or alternatively, as a substantial person, in terms of body weight. So regardless, substance, thickness here is a positive concept. It means things that are real, things that you can get your arms around, things that are practical and realistic, substantial, as I said. So far more importance on that rather than the thin shell of phony politeness that is just a veneer. It's only skin deep, easily penetrated. So the great person would take the substantial over the thinness, the flimsy. Okay, that's the first, that's line 27 there. So for all of us, for Tao cultivators, no amount of courteous expressions or proper form in following social protocols can compare to simple sincerity direct from the heart. And that's important. We have a duty to look beyond the surface and into the essence. So I'm assuming that everyone listening to me now, we will regard ourselves in some sense as cultivators of the Tao. If that is the case, we all have this duty to look beyond the surface and into the essence. So if you think about the problems that plague the world today, discrimination, bias, racism, all kinds of issues, many of those stem from people dwelling on the surface and never bothering to look into the essence. And therefore, someone's ethnic background, someone's social class, those attributes at the surface may cause people to pass judgment prematurely until they find out about the true essence of that person by looking deeper. So I think, the advice from Lao Tzu is rather timely for our time, for our world, in these modern times, just as it applied in ancient times. Now, let's continue on to talk about line 28. The great person abides in the real and does not dwell on the flower. So typically, as I mentioned previously, flower in our culture is seen as a positive thing. It's beautiful, it's blooming, it brings a smile to your face. Here, though, the context in ancient times specifically is a similar meaning as thin shell. So the metaphor being used is that plants, the flower is something that looks great but doesn't provide practical value, whereas a fruit can provide you with sustenance. So the flower in this case is being seen as something that looks great but isn't practical. Therefore, it makes a great deal of sense that the great person would abide in the real, the things that will bring actual benefits to humanity rather than things that merely look good but bring no benefits. So overall, the last line, the previous line was about fake etiquette. This line is about superficial knowledge. This is because superficial knowledge on the surface looks good. Like you might hear something and, oh yeah, that sounds pretty good. But when you dig deeper, you realize that it's actually based on things that people want to hear that are not necessarily true. One of the examples that I often used previously was that the philosophical teaching that you come across quite a bit nowadays says you are already perfect. There is nothing to do. You don't need to do anything, for everything is already done. So superficially, it sounds good. It's what people want to hear. Who doesn't want to hear that they are already perfect? When you dig deeper, though, you see that the people who subscribe to this, boy, they are the ones that need a lot of work. So you want to go a little deeper than that and look at reality. Therefore, and this is why I say no amount of fancy theories or physical speculations can compare to actual experience in real life. Moreover, Tao cultivators are much more concerned about putting in the work and building something great. This is represented in the metaphor of the fruit, not so much about striking a pose or looking good, and metaphorically represented by the flower. So overall, I think this makes sense. These two lines are a poetic pair, as you can see. So the great person abides in the substance, which is the real, does not dwell on the thin shell, which is the flower. Looking great, but useless. So we're now approaching the end of this chapter. This is the final line. Thus, they discard that and take this. Before we actually get there, I want to make sure that we get the last character here in line 27 and also the last character in 28. Make sure everyone understands the reference. So this, again, is a screenshot of the second half of the chapter. We're on 27 and 28. The last character here, we have the character for thin, flimsy. Then we have the character for flower. This character originally means magnificent or glorious. In ancient times, this was used in this context interchangeably with hua. So this is hua. The other character is hua, meaning flower. And that means, again, something that has a great appearance, but limited usefulness. So I want to make sure everyone gets the reference, the callback. You can see here that 27 calls back to 21. Same character, and 21 leads into line 22, the beginning of chaos. So why would the great person not want to dwell on the thin shell? Because the thin shell is the beginning of chaos. Everyone can see that, right? Now, let's look at the other one too. Hua, as I mentioned, the character that is used in synonymous context with hua, flower. That's a callback as well. It calls back from 28 back to 24. So why would Lao Tzu say that the great person will not dwell on the flower? Well, calling back to 24, the flowers of the Tao, is actually line 25, the beginning of ignorance. So so bottom line is that these two lines about abiding in substance and the real, these really mean that Lao Tzu is opposed to chaos and ignorance. Hopefully that makes sense. So I want to do a little bit more about line 23 here. Line 23 says, those with foreknowledge are the flowers of the Tao, which now you know is the beginning of ignorance. I want to drive home this point about knowledge being different from wisdom. So everything that you see here, the Tao Te Ching, first half, second half, all these different lines, they are about practical everyday wisdom rather than the acquisition of knowledge. What is the difference between the two? Are we not absorbing knowledge about these ancient tomes right now as we speak? Well, I want to illustrate that difference and make sure everybody is clear. So I have a slide here about the difference between the two. Keep in mind that wisdom, this is what is advocated in the Tao, in the Tao Te Ching. Knowledge is something that humanity uses that can be good or bad. It depends on the way we use it. So here we go. First thing, knowledge can be used positively or negatively, whereas wisdom, the difference is that wisdom must always be used for the common good. As opposed to knowledge, you can be using knowledge to take advantage of people. You can be using knowledge to cause a lot of harm. Whereas in wisdom, it's all about the common welfare, okay? So that's one difference. Knowledge can lead to arrogance and a feeling of superiority, even when you use it for good. And sometimes, especially when you use it for good, it can lead to arrogance. Look at me, I'm so great. I used my knowledge for good. Wisdom, on the other hand, is different in that when you actually utilize and apply wisdom in your life, it leads to joy. It leads to a sense of wonder. Wow, look at all this. And humility. When you perceive the Tao, the vastness and the greatness of it, when you perceive the oneness, the unity, the interconnectedness among all human beings, you cannot help but feel the sense of wonder and humility. And what a privilege and honor it is to be able to do my limited best for this greater whole. The more you think about it, the more you practice wisdom, the more humble you become. That's diametrically opposite to the path to arrogance that knowledge can bring. It's not to say that knowledge always leads to arrogance, just that it can. Then, another difference. Think about the nature of knowledge. Nature is all about exploring what is possible. Knowledge is asking the question, what can be done? So what about wisdom? Wisdom explores what is practical. What should be done? It's a different question. What can be done is about what are the limits? What happens if we transgress those limits? What happens if we push the boundary? Wisdom, because it is concerned with goodness and welfare, is asking the question, what should we do for everyone's benefit? What should be done rather than what can be done? Okay, one more. Knowledge. We all know this. We know that knowledge is rooted in facts, information, and data. The more, the better. That's great. That can lead to a positive scenario without a doubt. It can also lead to the negative, whereas wisdom is more about applications in everyday life. Not so much about absorbing, acquiring ever more facts, information, and data, but rather it is about more applications on everyday life, in everyday life, asking the question, how can we use this? So lastly, knowledge is gained through theories and experiments. Now, let me talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. I want to compare and contrast with wisdom. Wisdom is gained from reality and experience. I'm talking about your personal experience. I'm talking about the way you live life every day. So, and again, in pointing out the last bullet for knowledge, I want to wrap it back to the beginning, the first bullet for knowledge, that it can be used positively or negatively. When we talk about theories and experiments, this is the scientific method we're talking about. When done correctly, it can help humanity. It can increase our understanding of the natural world. So double-blind experiments, hypothesis, proof, evidence, etc. All of those can be very good. It can also be easily perverted by human beings. So for instance, we have already seen many examples in our world of experiments that were biased because they were paid for. We have seen scientists falsifying data. Yes, that's a reality. That's happened. It makes the world ever more chaotic and complex. We don't know what to trust. We don't know what to believe in. So again, this only emphasizes that knowledge is a double-edged sword. It can be good, it can be bad. Wisdom is all about the opposite, that it's all about what you actually do with your life, what you actually contribute to the world in a positive way. So with this, I hope everyone gets a really clear idea of knowledge versus wisdom and why Lao Tzu has spoken repeatedly in the Tao Te Ching, not just this chapter, but a bunch of other chapters in his opposition of knowledge. So now I think we're ready to tackle the last line. The last line says, thus they discard that and take this. So before we get into discard that, let me just work through the 5 characters in line 29 with you. The first character is thus, 故, thus. And then the 2 characters here, discard that. And then the last 2 characters, take this. So you can see the translation here is a very verbatim, literal rendition of the original. It adds a they, which is assumed, and it adds an and, which is connecting. So the original, if you add nothing, would be thus, discard that, take this. Translation, thus they discard that and take this. So this is a reference to the great person, to the Tao cultivators. Tao cultivators discard that. That is referring to everything that is shallow, glib, flashy, hollow, or generally lacking in substance. Things that are flimsy, things that don't last, things that are just the surface level. Then we want to make sure that we get clear on the scope of this line. This includes perceptions, opinions, ideas, expressions, interactions, and so on. Perceptions can be shallow. It can be focused only on surface appearance. Opinions can be shallow. It can be lacking in depth or insights. I remember one time speaking with a senior citizen who had come from a background of poverty and who did not have the benefit of education. And I remember she said that, well, with all the economic problems that we have, she said the government should step in, open up a factory, and give everyone who needs a job a job. So that, everyone, is an example of a shallow opinion. And so I explained to her that things don't happen magically. There's an overall economy that is interdependent. You can't just create a factory out of thin air if there's no one who's willing to buy the products of this particular factory. You would need to figure out what is needed, what the demand is, the quantity of that, and then have a factory that can respond to that demand in a cost-effective way. It gets into all kinds of things. So her concept, bless her heart, is that the government is sort of like the king or the emperor that can just wave a magic wand and cause something to happen instantaneously. That would be a shallow opinion. So a shallow idea, and this also includes expressions, shallow expressions. Shallow expressions, think about the guys that you know that will fall back on set phrases that really don't say much. Think about the dude who says, "Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying?" and then laughs. Okay, well, the dude hasn't said anything. That's a shallow expression, and that's kind of a caution there for Dell cultivators to avoid similar expressions. Shallow interactions. Hey, how you doing? Doing all right? And this is what I have seen previously. There are people who fall back again on those stock phrases. How's it going? How you been? And I have seen them when they don't get the answer they expect, like, they're in their mind. It's a script that runs like, "Hey, how you doing? Good, good. Okay." Now, sometimes when they say, "Hey, how you doing?" the other party says, "Well, yeah, I'm just busy working on XYZ." They did not get the script that they were looking for. So moments later, they ask the same question. "Hey, yeah, so how you doing?" That's because their mind really was not on the question that they were asking. They weren't paying attention to what the other person was actually saying. So anyhow, shallow interactions. This is what Dell cultivators discard. So in contrast, when Dell cultivators speak, the words are well thought out and measured. And this is a practice that we all need to get into. We all need to think before we speak. We all need to consider multiple perspectives and take the target audience into account. If your target audience is a 6-year-old, you will not be exercising your vocabulary in speaking with them. You will be speaking at a level they can comprehend, and yet you will stick to the truth. So the burden is on all Dao cultivators, you and me, to train ourselves in becoming master communicators with insights, words that are well thought out, expressions that are well thought out. And you don't want to overdo talking to kids with the baby talk either, because a lot of times kids can actually be much more sophisticated than we give them credit for. They appreciate an adult who speaks to them, not in coddling terms, but treat them as actual individuals with their own opinions. That usually has a very positive effect. Okay, now let's also cover the last two characters. Take this. Dao cultivators take this. That is, everything substantial, insightful, thoughtful, practical, test it. Test it because nothing beats the actual test of real world usage. That's when the rubber meets the road. So this is reflected in everything they do, and this is my challenge to everyone. Dao cultivators may not talk much, but when they speak, people pay attention. From experience, people know that they will hear something important and impactful when they pay attention to a Tao cultivator. So how do you know that you've actually reached this level of Tao mastery? By people's reaction. When you get to a point that you don't talk a whole lot usually, but when you speak up, suddenly everybody drops what they're doing, turns to you and listen intently. When you see that happening, you know that you have mastered this part of 38. So these are clear guidelines from Lao Tzu. In order to be great, you must get past the facade and get to what is real, because that is the Tao. Let's summarize all of that, and then and then before we get into the paraphrase, we will take a quick break. So here's the mini summary. I'll discard that and take this. This applies to great people and Tao cultivators, and I hope that all of us aspire to become great. All of us cultivate the Tao, and hopefully we can attain greatness as we are doing so. So what do we discard? As you have seen, we discard the flimsy, and then also the superficial. And those are the characters representing that. What do we take? What do we dwell on? What do we emphasize and stress in life? The substantial. And remember, I talked about this character Ho, meaning thickness. And that's it's easy to extrapolate from there to the real meaning in this context, the substantial, that which has substance. The substantial and the real. So I want to set them side by side, the thin and the thick, representing the flimsy and the substantial, then the superficial and the real. This is important because what Lao Tzu is saying is that in a real sense, the superficial, the surface level, the veneer, the facade is not real, in the sense that it's illusory. It's an illusion that can fade away or shatter into 1,000 pieces when in contact with the actual reality of the situation. So in a sense, the superficial is not real. So let's do some examples. Following elaborate etiquette to project a civilized and refined image, okay? That is not the way of the Tao. The way of the Tao is this: being simple, sincere, direct, and transparent in words and actions. When I was a teenager, I used to think that the left-hand side was about me being cool, me demonstrating a huge vocabulary for my age. I was only a teenager, and yet I know all these big fancy words, right? So I would project this image of the civilized and refined young scholar, talking in terms of all these fancy philosophies. Well, that wasn't the Tao. The Tao was me being just myself, being sincere, direct, and transparent. What I did before was this bullet: talking more due to a desire to show off knowledge. I plead ignorance as a teenager who had no idea what he was doing, who did not know anything about the Tao, who had read up on the Tao, had been trained in the Tao, but did not apply them to real life to really understand the essence. So I talked a lot due to a desire to show off knowledge. So this is my confessional as well. What is the Tao? The Tao is talking less, not more, talking less due to a preference to show actual concrete results. I like to think that I have evolved as a person to get to more to the right than to the left. So now remember, the metaphor that we use in this chapter for the left-hand side, the flimsy, the superficial, the looking good but useless, is the flower. So I would like to ask everyone not to read too much into the metaphor and think that flowers are always bad. It's just something that was convenient that is being used in this context to demonstrate something that has a great appearance but can't really be used for anything. On the right-hand side, what is the metaphor? I hope everyone remembers. It's the fruit. It's the fruit because you can actually consume the fruit and get nutritional value out of it. So that's used as a metaphor for things that actually work for us. Let's go to the paraphrase. Our purpose in composing the paraphrase is to demonstrate complete understanding by expressing the original meaning in modern language. So in that sense, the paraphrase is different from a translation. We can take more liberties with the text as long as we stick with the original meaning, we'll be okay. So this is a long chapter, so we're going to need to work our way through it one section at a time. Beginning with the first section, which is all about high virtue, low virtue. And here's the way that I would paraphrase. The highest level of virtue is never intentionally virtuous. Those at this level practice virtues naturally, and that makes them truly virtuous. The low level of virtue, on the other hand, never loses sight of virtues. Those at this level need to constantly remind themselves to be virtuous, and that is how we know they do not truly possess virtues. So right off the bat, we see the difference between high virtue and low virtue. Then we continue on with 4 additional lines about the difference between them. How can we paraphrase them? Here's what I would like to offer and suggest. The highest level of virtue is unforced, uncontrived, and unattached. At this level, one takes actions without any kind of hidden agenda. The low level of virtue, on the other hand, is always contrived and attached. There is always some sort of agenda. This can be a positive thing when it manifests as discipline to advance toward high virtue. So the point there is that we don't necessarily have a negative thing when we are talking about low virtue. So we're about to leave the high virtue versus low virtue and move on to benevolence, righteousness, and etiquette. So the paraphrase for that will be as follows. The highest level of benevolence is contrived because it has the specific goal of doing good in the world. There is no agenda beyond that. The highest level of righteousness is also contrived because it has the specific goal of enacting justice in the world, but it does begin and end with the agenda of self-justification. Finally, The highest level of etiquette is contrived because it is full of rules to follow and boundaries to observe. Those who practice it are often quite insistent that others comply, and if they fail to get a response for their demands, they may resort to physical enforcement. And this is the level of high etiquette. So as we can see, when we work our way to high etiquette, we are already pretty far from the level of the Tao. So this is the first half of Tao Te Ching, chapter 38. Let's go ahead and advance to the second half. Second half is equally substantial, divided into 4 sections. As we talked about before, it starts out with a sequence of what happens when you lose one level and have to go to the next one down. So here's the paraphrase for that. This is how the world deteriorates from the Tao to chaos. When the Tao is lost, we step down to the level of virtues, which can still be very close to the Tao. If we lose virtues, then we descend to compassion or benevolence, and then justice or righteousness. If all of these are gone, then all we have left is the level of etiquette. So this is describing from the top down what happens when you lose something that is good and you have to settle for something that is not quite as good. The hidden message here is also that if you need to go back up to the level of the Tao, then these are the sequence that you have to advance. Next, we talk about really the focus for our discussion today, the 2 kinds of people that Lao Tzu would single out as examples of the lowest level, the instigator of chaos, the source of ignorance, what we today would characterize as misinformation. So we begin with those who have etiquette, with those who demonstrate this phony level of hypocritical etiquette. So this level of etiquette, this is not a good thing from the Tao perspective, because those who are well-versed with social etiquette are often the ones who pretend loyalty while plotting betrayal. Throughout history, such people have often been the source of chaos and strife. This is in reference to ancient Chinese history, but if you take a look at European history, or indeed history from any other part of the world, you'll find this human pattern repeating itself everywhere. Next, we get to the knowledge, potentially the tricky parts in this chapter, because we are conditioned to think of knowledge as a good thing. So here's the paraphrase for that. They are similar to those who try to impress others with their knowledge, just as the courteous ones may actually be treacherous. The ones who seem knowledgeable may actually be quite shallow. In the Tao, such people are regarded as the source of ignorance. So now the conclusion. And the conclusion, as you heard today, is about the great person. What would the great person do? What would the great person not do? Here's the paraphrase. Therefore, the great person looks to the substance in everything and does not dwell on surface level appearance, which can be misleading. He also emphasizes the practical in the real world rather than a superficial understanding that may fail. Thus, his approach in life is to always discard the illusory and embrace reality, or the Tao. Now, we're at the very end of chapter 38. I think everyone remembers what I ask everyone to do whenever we reach the end of a chapter, and that is I ask the question, how can we link up the meaning from the very end to the very beginning? How can we have a come full circle so that our understanding can form one coherent truth? That will be the essence of this chapter. So I have a slide here specifically for that purpose. Chapter 38, full circle. And the question that I'm asking is, as you have just heard, how do we connect the meaning back to the beginning to really get the essence of this chapter? I'm pretty sure you would agree with me that this is an important thing to do. So here's the way that I would frame the answer. First I would encourage everyone to also come up with the answer on your own as a way to exercise your understanding of chapter 38. Then I want to present a way to link it back to the beginning. So the beginning, remember, is about the different levels, from the Tao to virtues to benevolence to righteousness to etiquette. That was from the beginning of the chapter. At the very end, we talk about how the great person is opposed to the shallow appearance of knowledge and politeness, preferring depth and substance. We have just seen that, and I'm pretty sure everyone can see the truth in these words, that this is real wisdom from Lao Tzu. Now, the linkage. When you and I and Tao cultivators in general insist on the realistic and practical in life, that discipline, that insistence, that's what will take us up the stairway step by step. When I'm talking about the stairway, I am referring to the different levels that we have been discussing throughout this first half and the second half. The different levels that form sort of a ladder or stairway to heaven, if you will, that we have to traverse a step at a time. Some of the steps may take more effort, more time, but it is a requirement for us to ascend, to go up through all of them. So specifically, what I mean by that, when we are linking up the meaning from the end to the beginning, is that step one, the level or the step of etiquette and rituals. So this is where I will say that etiquette and rituals don't have to be a negative thing. So don't make sure you're not getting the false impression from this chapter that they must always be negative. They can be the first step, or what I called last time as Tao 101. When you practice etiquette and rituals, it can be meditation in motion. As you're going through the motions, your mind is tranquil and your mind is establishing a connection with the Tao. So it can be extremely important. And this is why I honor and respect etiquette and rituals in all great traditions. If I were to visit a temple or church or synagogue, I definitely observe, pay respects, and follow the etiquette and rituals exactly as I should. That is the first step. It's not all the steps. As you can see, you can tell just from the graphic that there are many more steps to come. This chapter, the value is that it gives you all the other steps and reminds you that these are all the things you have to do. The next level up from etiquette and rituals is the level of high righteousness. And this is the level or the step where we do what is right. Doing what is right at the right time in the right way for the right reasons. And trust in the Tao that the right thing will be done for us when we need it the most. So the story to illustrate that, purchasing Yi from a couple of meetings ago. So that is a necessary process to go through. It's a necessary step to walk on as we go up the staircase. Then we get to the level of high benevolence. That is just kindness and compassion. Now, initially, we may be working on benevolence, kindness, compassion with the purpose, with a specific purpose to project the image of being gentle and kind and compassionate. But as we continue on, though, it should become much, much more selfless. It should be much, much more focused on how other people will benefit from my actions and my words and my examples. That gets you to high benevolence. That's you taking another step up. Then we get to low virtue. So this is from the first half of the chapter. Low virtue, as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be a negative thing. It could just be that you are devoting time and attention to the discipline, the reminders of practicing virtues until they become second nature to you, until they come naturally. When they do come naturally, you've taken another step to high virtue. When you are at the level of high virtue, everything flows naturally. You don't have to think about it. You simply are a virtuous person. No reminders are required. That is when you are just one step away from the Tao. So that is the meaning. All of this is driven by our insistence and discipline to focus not on the shallow, but on the in-depth, not on the surface appearance, but on the real and practical. So there is the essence that I would like to present to you, the meaning of chapter 38 coming full circle. The summary that I have in mind for today is the final summary for 38. This is sort of the very last word that we have in our talk on chapter 38. And it's just a reminder. Final thoughts on Tao Te Ching 38. So here, I'm taking the very last line from 38. If you recall, the last line is about discard that and take this. So in the summary, I want to be very clear that when I say discard that, I am referring to the superficial, the fraudulent, the hypocritical. All the things that I think we human beings naturally dislike. Then take this. Here, we want to flip it around and think about the diametrically opposite attributes that we naturally respond to. We resonate with the genuine, the authentic, the heartfelt. We look for that when we interact with other people. So what Lao Tzu says is that give the same thing to others as your gift to the world. Now, let's be a little more specific, run through a couple of quick examples. That'll be our summary and our final thoughts on 38. So, suggestion, discard the following. 1, discard presenting a false front to draw attention, to show off, or save face. Sometimes the temptation to show off can be pretty strong. As a Tao cultivator, the admonition is to watch that as an attempt of the ego to satisfy or gratify itself. And the discipline is to keep that in check and realize that it's ultimately illusory. That realization will cause the desire to vanish. Then the other item, as an example to discard, is to blindly accept unproven assertions and conspiracy theories. It is always a good idea to regard everything that is unproven with a healthy dose of skepticism. Now, especially in this day and age, we have to be so careful with conspiracy theories. As we're connected to the internet, to social media, we're all going to be exposed to a lot of them. They don't always have the proof to back them up. And sometimes the proof that is offered don't stand up to scrutiny. So it is important for us to not blindly accept them. It is important for us to hear from actual authorities on the reality of the situation. In some cases, we can even see for ourselves what is true and what is not. So very important to not blindly accept everything. So two things to take. One, say what you mean and mean what you say. This is to align your expression of yourself with your internal thoughts. So what you're thinking about, say that. Express what it is in your mind. So that's one kind of alignment. Another kind of alignment is the second and final point, and that is to practice what you preach. That is to walk your talk, not just be able to talk your talk. And this is to cultivate consistency in words and actions. This is to align what you say and what you do. So a little bit different. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.